Hello, good people of the internet. I'm going to jump right into an introduction here. Who I am, what my goal is for this little interaction. I have my notes with me because I don't know exactly what I'm doing, but we'll figure it out as we go. My name is Charlie. I'm a pretty normal guy. That is to say, I'm not an expert in anything. I have an unimpressively normal educational history. I have had a bunch of jobs, but nothing that has given me a great depth of insight into any particular, subset of knowledge or anything. So I'm just not an expert at anything. um, and right now I'm even less impressively just a bartender. Between careers always, and bartending is a nice one. It has all the great perks to it, but one of the cool perks is I get to listen in on people's conversations. Right, I get to eavesdrop for a living. Get to hear what people think about sports. Get to hear about their personal life. Get to hear about every sort of thing. But I also get to especially the past couple elections, get to hear about politics. And so I have this distinct advantage where I get to hear people's opinions on all levels of the gamut, all the socioeconomic, all the political spectrum, rich folks, poor folks, country folks, city folks, and very recently, past couple elections, right, I started to notice reoccurring talking points on both sides, not necessarily at the same time or anything, but these handful of quips or terms or names or acts or whatever would continually come up with very strong opinions attached to them, but I never really heard anyone talking about what they actually were. And so, as someone who's listening to, everyone talking about it, and even you go online, news pundits, everyone's, talking about these major things because that's the hot topic, right? For instance, so many people, talked about Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act, right? And so few people spoke about them as though they knew they were the same thing, right? So they had very strong opinions on them and called them something different, even a lot of times based on what side of the aisle they were on, but they couldn't say exactly what it was, or that it was called this other thing, or they didn't know exactly how it helped or how it hurt. They just knew they had very strong opinions on it. Most recently, I'd say tariffs would be one where so many people have such strong opinions based on, from what I understand, someone else's opinions, but the actual understanding of how tariffs work, where they came from, etc., has been lost sort of in translation. And I think more people now are having a better understanding because we're living through it in real time. But I'd still say that, a lot of the finer points of what a tariff is, how it affects, blah, 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 is really quite lost, and people are hammering this term tariffs, 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 in a good way or a bad way, but we're not discussing literally, physically, what they are and what they're doing. And this has become, sort of a common theme. And I think that there are a handful of reasons for it. Like, I do not have social media. I don't have a smartphone or anything like that. But I'm aware that pretty much everyone else does. And so, everyone's got more access to news and commentators and opinions and, chat rooms and things like this. And so, it's really easy for us to, especially if we're talking about something complicated, which a lot of this stuff really is, right? Constitutional law is complicated. Like very specific biological issues are complicated, right? AI is a very complicated, discussion. You can know 2 or 3 basic facts about it that may or may not be close enough to real facts, and then formulate a very strong opinion. Or even, more commonly, I think, we tend to align ourselves with someone in the pop culture realm, whether it's a celebrity or a commentator, some TV personality or YouTuber or whatever, right? Or politician or parent, friend, sibling, pastor, teacher, whatever. And we get into the habit of trusting them with so many things, and then kind of offering them our loyalty in terms of opinions on certain topics. And for the most part, I'd like to remind that we're usually getting our opinions from what would be considered commentators. They're not necessarily breaking stories, but even a lot of the people in the news, you look at CNN or you look at Fox, and they're giving you news, but they're giving you a small piece of news and a very large opinion about it, and more of an explanation of their opinion than of the actual topic. And for the most part, they're all quite intelligent people that are explaining this to us, and whether they're intentionally avoiding the topic or they just don't have time to explain it, every time you have a debate, every time you have a 20-minute news segment, whatever, a lot of the finer points of whatever the topic is, and there's a lot of things going on right now. A lot of the actual information is just kind of sifting through, and we're missing a lot of it. And so what my hope is with these is to fill in the gaps with small amounts of information, right? I'm not going to take this crumbling foundation and build a library of knowledge or anything, but I'm hoping to take some cement and plug in a couple of the holes of the foundation, and then people smarter than me, everyone out there with information and access, will be able to fill in even more holes and build something out of this, right? Create a real conversation instead of a handful of talking points that we kind of throw at each other with a certain type of intonation in our voice to decry it or to praise it. And so again, I'm going to hopefully be providing just information, just facts, not all of the facts. And I'm sure that I'm missing a lot of really important stuff. And my hope too is not just to change your mind or give you an opinion, but to get you to see the questions that I'm asking, and to hopefully it will bring up questions for yourself, and then turn this into a real conversation, whatever the topic is that we happen to be talking about. And it's ultimately just a practice in promoting critical thinking, right? And critical thinking is something that the internet does not want, that social media does not want you to do. And we all are engaged in critical thinking every day. Whatever it is we're doing in our day, whether it's timing out, how we get to work and being like, all right, I'll have to wake up and brush my teeth and this and that, and just putting little, subconscious, math in there and figuring out, and then we usually get to work right around on time. Whatever it is we have to do, preparing dinner or, going for a jog, we just figure out logistics, we have weather, we have, timing, we have energy, we have all these things to take into account, and then we come up with an opinion or a solution and, go along our day for the most part pretty fine. And so when it comes to a lot of the very important, grander things, I think that especially with things like Twitter, with things like, all the social media, all the methodology of delivering and receiving news these days is so fast and so scratching the surface that it doesn't want you to use this thing that humans have called critical thinking, this great tool. And all critical thinking in this case is asking questions. Someone says, oh, well, it's going to snow today, you know. Critical thinking. All right, well, I'm in Texas. It's June. It's 114 today. I haven't heard anything about it. It's probably not going to snow, right? And so instead of just taking for granted what we hear from whomever we think we should trust, you know, we take things in, we process it. If it sounds right, we move forward. If it sounds a little weird, we look into it. And that's you know, I mean, the easiest thing to do in the world. We have Google at our fingertips. And so that is the purpose of all of this. And so my first topic is actually going to be fascism. Super fun to look into. And the reason I'm picking this is because there's been this really, really interesting, and it might not be anything new at all. Maybe this has been done for the past 60, 80 years since fascism, right? But both sides of the aisle, whether it's politicians or groups or corporations or nonprofits or whatever, are calling the other side fascist. And I find it really interesting, you know, when, you know, BLM and Antifa and Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer and MAGA and Democrats and Republicans are all accusing each other of being fascist. And no one's really talked about what it means to be fascist. So ultimately, what that means to me is either everyone's fascist, that is accused of being fascist, or some are and some aren't, or if we look into it, none are. And I'm not trying to convince you one way or the other that any group is or is not. What we're hoping to do is look at fascism, the actual thing, break it down a little bit, and there's still a ton that I'm not going to cover that is out there that, you know, if any questions pop in your head, you know, look it up and, you know, and see if it fits this narrative, you know, see if the Democratic National Convention fits a fascist narrative, see if MAGA fits a fascist narrative, right? So without any further, I guess, you know, we'll just talk about fascism in a little while. And this is not going to be a TED Talk, right? This is, you know, again, what I said in the beginning is I'm not an expert. This is just me doing a basic amount of research with questions that came up with me. We'll call it a Chuck Chat, and which is superbly less official than a TED Talk, you know, but hopefully what it does is it, you know, it makes us think about fascism, you know, the history of it, some tenets of it, and hopefully I say some things that you say, that doesn't sound right, or that sounds like only the partial true, both of which might be the case. And then, you know, fill in the blanks for yourself, or if I say something that opens up another question, look into it, you know, and this is, and, you know, the more we know, the better, and then we can, you know, the more information we have, you can use this critical thinking to plug in when other issues come up. We can do the same thing for when someone starts saying Marxist or communist or everything, right? You know, just making sure that when someone claims something to be something, it fits that actual narrative. Because otherwise we could just all go around calling everyone a fascist and there's no questions about it, right? So fascism is a system of government. And that's what it is, right? And over the decades, I think it's devolved into, and this is why we use it so much all the time on both sides, is it just turned into a word that means someone that is anti-American or anti-democratic or generally evil, maybe violent, authoritarian, right? Obviously, but it's just kind of this blanket term for something that we know we don't like, something that we know is against our better good, right? And fascism, you know, has very specific tenets, and these are the things that we could look into and say, all right, well, is this group this? Do they believe in this, right? And so primarily it's an autocracy, which means it has a singular leader, which also means that there's no checks and balance, right? You don't have a court system questioning the legality of the choice. It's a one-party system, so there's no competition. You know, maybe you have two fascists running against each other or something, and but there's no, the fascist versus the democratic socialist. That's not how it works. And it's a system of government that puts the nation and the race over the individual importance, right? And so, interestingly, a lot of fascist tenets do actually sound like progressive social policies, because they're protecting the people in their nation, but they're protecting the people of the preferred race and nationality within their nation after they violently pushed everyone else out. And so, so the whole point of this practice is to make it so that you have one unified people with one unified belief in one unified nation under one singular leader that is followed to the T regardless. And if anything, if any insurrections come up, then they're pretty comfortably wiped out and very easily, believably, like, oh, these guys were evil. Oh, okay. Well, they were evil. We shouldn't get rid of them, And fascism, like almost everything else, started as a political movement or a social revolution, right? Because, until you have a leader that is in your party, then it's pretty much a political movement. The Green Party has never had a president. And they may or may not have had, there's probably been maybe some Green Party like senators or, mayors or something like that. But for the most part, that's a political movement. It has not gained enough traction to be even really so much of a political party. It's a social movement. They have very specific ideals. And then, but fascism became a true system of government with Mussolini, who was the first fascist dictator in Italy in the 1920s, right? And he was named prime minister by his predecessor, and then he used violence, coercion, bribery, all these tactics that are very obvious to push out, to intimidate anyone who opposed him, and became the supreme leader. Let's see. Now, most autocrats, right, we're looking at tenets. We're looking at things that these types of leaders and these types of governments do now. All right, and around our world, we have autocrats. We have dictators. We have, like prime ministers, right? These supreme leaders. We have them in China and in Cuba and in Russia and in North Korea and all over the place. And when we look historically, we can see similarities with these types of leaders, because most what we would consider Western or progressive countries are looking to the future, right? That's kind of their thing. We're going to build a future, right? And so when we look at most autocratic governments, they are in support of acts of war, acts of imperialism, and their goal is usually the betterment of the country. And what that betterment usually means when they talk about it is restoring the country to a previous state that they thought was better, right? So when Mussolini was rising to power, he was on a platform of national rejuvenation, right? And so he picked out things that he saw as weaknesses within his country, within society, and then he said, look at how we used to be. Italy was, Rome, it was big, it was everything. It was this great empire. And so he was saying, we're going to restore Italy. We're going to have a national rejuvenation, We're going to bring it back to its previous glory. Okay, when we look at Hitler, Hitler's goal was to reunite a pan-Germanic state, right? So Germany was all these, this huge amount of land in these like little tiny areas or whatever, and then the war happened and everything fractured. And so it was a whole bunch of little countries, right? So Hitler's purpose, his goal, was to cleanse his land of any impure blood and bring back all these countries together under one singular rule as one nation, one Reich. We've seen this in other places. North Korea trying to reunite. China wants to reclaim Taiwan. Vladimir Putin right now is denazifying Ukraine, but his ultimate goal is to reunify the Soviet Union before it collapsed in 1991 or 3 or whatever. So we see this semantic of looking back at a time when these leaders, thought that the country reflected a greater time. Mao Zedong did the same thing in China, right? And even here in the United States, we've recently had a president that his whole, he was running off of Make America Great Again, right? And who was that? Ronald Reagan, of course. And so, so this is a very interesting similarity between autocratic nations and leaders historically. And often we see these movements grow very often after a time of defeat. And so, Hitler rose to power after the loss of World War I that he took very personally. Italy rose to power similarly, or Mussolini. We have Vladimir Putin, who started rising the ranks after the fall of the Soviet Union. We have, you just take all these, so many different examples. And so what happens, interestingly, is a nation suffers some kind of loss or perceived embarrassment, and then the upcoming leader will sort of create a language that we are the victim, and we are going to rise up stronger by pushing out whatever and going back to a time when no one would mess with us or whatever, right? We started to see a change after 9/11. This is when, we started to get more nervous about other countries, where, the TSA, we started to bug everybody, Homeland Security. This is when ICE was created. And so, the United States, a lot of individuals became, angry. They became more patriotic because we'd suffered a loss, we'd suffered an embarrassment. We became more skeptical of someone who doesn't look like an archetypical American, white, English-speaking, probably Christian. And so, and it's a natural reaction. We were attacked, right? Other countries do have bad things happen to them. So it's not an unnatural reaction. It's just something that we should be aware of and not let run amok. Not let get out of hand, because that's when we can listen to someone who spits a really good game and then go from that very normal response to an extremist response, which is not uncommon. You look at Hamas was created, because of a conflict with Israel, right? And it could have been a conflict that stayed normal and maybe was figured out in some kind of peaceful solution, but instead this group went to the extreme, and there were probably some really good speakers and had some really good arguments, and it made sense. And they were angry, and they were hurt, and they were injured, and they were desperate, and they were protective. And so, you know, you create these extreme views that envelope normal people into extremism. And a lot of times too, you know, you look at the leaders that are going into these, you know, after they claim, you know, the victimhood of the nation, after they, you know, sort of talk about patriotism and getting back to and nationalism is a specific term, and that means, you know, preferring certain racial identity or national identity. Right, and so, you know, you can be an anything nationalist. You can be a Christian nationalist, which means you probably are, you know, preferential towards Christians. You can be a white nationalist, which means you're preferential towards, you know, people with white skin. You can be, you know, probably be an Islamic nationalist. You can be a Jewish nationalist. You can be a Russian nationalist. You can be, you know, like a whatever nationalist. It's just talking about only including those that you are familiar with, and that you can relate to in very specific, mostly, you know, biological ways. Let's see. And so a lot of, when you look at a lot of the leaders that take on these roles in these types of autocratic nations, in, you know, fascist countries, a lot of what they also promise is to dismantle what they see as weakness or corruption or moral depravity within systems and organizations in the country, right? And so we have this language of our country was great, and then we were injured or hurt in some way, and in between there, the bureaucrats, the politicians, the celebrities, whomever, you know, the billionaires created these evil entities, or they entered into things like Congress and Supreme Court and Senate or whatever, and they corrupted it, right? We have these bad actors, and so a lot of the promises made are to get rid of those, to, you know, to clean out these bodies, or get rid of them altogether if they don't see them as supporting the cause of the nation, right? And again, this is just, you know, commonalities. If you look at what governments have done, what leaders have done, this is the commonalities, and a lot of these values also tend to change based on popular demand, right, which is populism. And we've seen that with weed, right? So marijuana was something that was heavily argued against by a lot of Republican politicians, saying if you vote me, it's never going to be legal. Well, now all of a sudden everyone smokes weed except for a very small amount of people. We see vets, we see farmers, we see Republicans, we see that it's helping agriculture, we see it's getting people off of pharmaceuticals, we see it's pain management, we see it's not addictive, and it's actually helping bring people away from other addictive products. We see that it's helping our farmers, and it's helping out our tax base and all this stuff. And so the politicians, like, their ideologies change, and they may still be against it, or maybe they were never against it to begin with, but they're not, that's not their platform. You know, abortion's a very big one, and that will continue to be so. A new one is transgender and gay identity and stuff, things like this. And so it changes based on, you know, what the cause, any kind of deviant sexual behavior, which is probably, you know, like if Mussolini himself didn't actually care, then he probably had some very powerful people who did, who had either religious views or personal preferences or something like this. And so, you know, you demonize certain activities that society is okay with demonizing. Mussolini is quoted saying, "War is to man what maternity is to women." Right, and so this kind of classical, I mean, it was the, you know, 20s and 30s or whatever, this classical misogynistic women in the kitchen, only there to produce children, only, I mean, like, obviously talking about like traditional values, the normal household and things like this. And these ideals were placed over an individual's right to be able to love or practice or spend their time with other people in the way they wanted to. And so that is another big tenet too, is, obviously everyone's going to have their opinion, but to make these part of the law is now taking away freedoms, and freedoms that you might not like, but that's the point of freedom. And it's also interesting to note as well that because fascist Italy, like once it had a population that was mostly homogenous, mostly, white, Italian, whatever religion they were, probably Christians, some of their policies made them very, very popular. So Benito Mussolini was seen as a hero by his people, after the fight. And even FDR was a huge fan of Italian fascism. And Benito Mussolini was a big fan of Western capitalism as well. They were both impressed by the different capabilities of the other. And so I just wrote down a couple sort of interesting kind of tidbits about fascism that I didn't really know. So Social Security was actually ramped up under an Italian fascist dictator. However, it was mostly for card-carrying party members, right? Because fascism, right, is focused on the chosen race and the chosen nationality and not freedom for all, right? That being said, those that were a part of that group were very well taken care of. They had child labor laws enacted in 1927. Here in the United States, we didn't have those until 1938. They had maternity leave in the sense that it was illegal to force a pregnant woman to work 2 months before she gave birth, and it was the same with 1 month afterwards. So it was basically mandatory maternity leave, minimum 3 months. And again, probably mostly for Italian nationalist, fascist party members or sympathizers or whatever. And the United States didn't have that as law, I believe, until about 1993. Fascist Italy supported a minimum wage in the 20s. The U.S. was, again, 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act. There were a couple other acts that were based very strikingly off of Italian fascism. The 40-hour work week, 1938. Ours was 1940, so directly after. And it was popular with a lot of academics. It was popular in a lot of colleges. They even had, like, you look at the 20s and the 30s, the black turtlenecks was a pro-fascist fashion movement, and the American and Italian administrations sort of mirrored each other's, what they liked about the other for a while, up until they got tied in with the Nazi movement, which was an even more extreme nationalist version of fascism, right? And so, again, that's my last card. So, the goal was to talk about fascism as fascism, and not just fascism in terms of if I think Kamala Harris or Mike Pence or BLM or Proud Boys are fascists. I'm talking about fascism as a thing. And then hopefully plugged in some of the questions as to what fascism actually means, and open the door to way more questions, because I know this is only 2 notes out of 80 years of history. And most fascist countries, most fascist governments ended in the mid 40s, late 40s, after World War II, after the Germans lost, with like a couple exceptions. Spain and another country had fascism up until the 70s, and then it kind of petered off. But it's always something to look out for. And I think that the major thing too is that every government is probably not the purest form of that government. So we can have a democratic republic that might have some fascist tendencies, up to including Social Security. It's kind of like a liberal progressive fascism, but it might still be fascism. And that's something that, again, if any of this sounds weird or sounds interesting or sounds like a new avenue to explore, like, this is what this conversation's for. Instead of us just bickering and saying, you're a fascist, no, you're a fascist, we're like, all right, well, let's sit down and talk about fascism for a second. And then when someone accuses or you think someone is being fascist, you can say, well, you're fascist because, or, well, they're not exactly fascist because they blah, 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 and, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's enough rambling for the day. So hopefully this just got you to ask a couple questions that might have been passed over during debates or conversations about who is and who isn't fascist. And, brought up a few more questions, brought up some things that you'd like to look up yourself. There's so much information. I touched on almost none of it. But, this is a good little start. I think that hopefully we rein in the madness that social media has created, where having a normal debate is almost off the table, and we start to sort of soften the edges and bring it back to where we can have a conversation, and where we can, if someone doesn't know what fascism is, then someone will be like, all right, well, this is why they're that. Instead of just being able to call some things. This is in the 50s. We shouldn't just be like, oh, they're communists, and be like, oh, done. This isn't the Massachusetts in the 1800s, where we should just be able to call someone a witch and then, oh, they're a witch, and so this is my first step in turning our political discourse back into an actual conversation. And I hope there's at least one or two interesting things, and I would love if anyone would reply in any positive way. I'm sure I'm going to get a whole bunch of horrible classic internet whatevers. I've probably heard most of them, so you're not going to hurt my feelings. If I misspoke or whatever, or had any claims that were incorrect, or if I missed anything, or if there's anything just further the conversation, throw it on me. Let's talk about fascism for a while in a calm, almost academic way. And then when fascism becomes a part of the conversation for other topics, we'll just have a more well-rounded knowledge of what we're talking about, instead of using words that we just don't understand. Neil Tyson deGrasse or whatever could give me a 50-minute speech on his opinions on quasars, and at the end I could definitely agree or disagree, but I still would have no idea what quasars are. And I still kind of don't know what quasars are. But I have a small idea of what fascism is. Maybe one day we'll talk about quasars, and hopefully you have just a little bit more of an idea of what actual fascism is in a conversational setting, or especially when you hear it from other people, and you will. It is a very common term. We love to hear about it. So now when you hear someone say, oh, this fascist, blah, 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 you could, take it with a grain of salt and assess it for yourself. And that's all I got.